motion that we adopt the agenda as is. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. And all in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
That passes unanimously. And moving on next to approval of the minutes from our special meeting on 8/2/21.
We move to approve them all at the same time?
There will be modifications on one of them, so I'm just going to do them individually.
I'd like to request a change to the minutes on August 2nd to include the full wording of the motion that we made with regard to hiring more officers and CSLs.
So just to clarify, the motion is in, well, the text is, sorry, we said we were going to make a motion for it, but the actual motion did not make it into the minutes.
Exactly.
All right. I second that.
I think the process may be simply to table the minutes. Shireen, would you know?
I think I would have amended them. And, you're saying, I think we could approve them with that amendment
Okay.
made, right?
Yeah. Then that would be my motion, is
Yeah.
to approve them with that amendment, that the entire motion be included in the minutes.
I second that motion. Any discussion? All in favor of that amendment, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And, all right. I think technically I said just for those minutes. So I guess for minutes from 7:27 and 7:20, any amendments any amendments to the any amendments to the minutes from those meetings? Not seeing or hearing any. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye. That passes unanimously. And that moves us on to agenda item 3.01, which is the public forum. At this point, anybody that's in the public section is welcome to have a seat at this table here, and you have a couple minutes to speak to us. So if anyone would like to partake, now's your time. Not seeing or hearing anybody, and with that, that jumps us into our presentations. I believe one is time certain for 6:20. I'm not sure if you're ready to go now. If you are, then the floor is yours, Mr. George. Thank you.
So,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I was going to say, and we have here to present is State's Attorney Sarah George to speak to us about alternatives to arrest. And thank you very much for being here with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. I'm not sure presentation is exactly what I would say. If I was supposed to do a presentation, I apologize. I thank you for having me. I don't know several of you, so it's nice to meet you. I have heard a lot about the sort of new police commission. I've been following a lot of the work you guys are doing. I really appreciate it. I know that you've heard a lot from the community, and I know that you've heard a lot from Chief Murad and from representatives from the BPOA. I think what led to me coming was having conversations with people about prosecutorial discretion and how that relates to police discretion, and what our office is doing, especially during a global pandemic, but really what we've been trying to do as an office in general to limit the number of cases coming into the system, limit the number of people coming into our system. So for some people, you might know all of this, and I apologize if you do, but I'm going to pretend that you don't so that I don't miss out on anything or assume anything I shouldn't. The office of the Chittenden County State's Attorney is responsible for all of the criminal prosecution in this county. Anything that Burlington Police Department investigates, unless it goes through the federal system, comes through our office. There are a lot of people within the system that have what's called prosecutorial or police discretion. Prosecutors, from my perspective, have the most discretion and therefore the most power within the criminal legal system. Not just because of the things they can do, but the things that they can choose not to do. And in some ways, that's, from my perspective, more important. There's a lot of national attention right now on policing. There's also a lot of national attention on prosecution, rightfully. And that discretion, for a very, very, very long time, has been used, in my opinion, to over-police and over-prosecute people, bring far too many people into our system with actually very little evidence to support the benefits that we, at least initially, thought we would be seeing. Prosecutors, more than anybody else, have probably 50 to 100 opportunities within the life of a case to, yes?
Could you speak into the mic or turn the mic up so everyone in the room can hear, please?
Is that better?
Yeah, it also affects how people can hear when they watch back on,
Yep.
like, town meeting television.
Okay.
Thank you.
Keep it very close. So what prosecutors can decide on their own with absolutely no authority from anybody else, including judges or police or defense attorneys, is whether or not to charge somebody. And if they do decide to charge somebody with a crime, what that charge is. For example, whether they decide to charge somebody with a felony or a misdemeanor, with 1 count or 10. Every one of those decisions is up to a prosecutor and nobody else. Law enforcement can cite somebody for a particular crime, but we are under no obligation to charge the person with that particular crime or any crime. We look at the affidavits and decide what charges we think are appropriate. My office, the policy within my office, or the philosophy, is to charge somebody with the least serious offense that still captures the importance and the seriousness of the conduct. So if there is somebody who a charge comes over as a felony, a good example of this is a felony for a theft that is over $1,000, when really the only reason it's a felony is because of the amount of the theft. It's not actually based on anything else. We will often charge those as misdemeanors, but require that the person pay back the felony amount. So that's an example of things that we can decide with no need to answer to anybody else about it. We can also decide whether to divert those cases. So if we decide we are going to charge somebody, but we're going to send them to diversion, or we're going to send them to Tamarack. Those are diversion programs that the state has where somebody will go into it. They're required to do substance use treatment or mental health treatment or do community service or do a restorative process or pay back restitution. And if they do those things and they fulfill a contract, then their charges are dropped and their records are expunged. We can, if we decide to charge somebody and actually send them through the system, we have full control over what conditions of release we request, whether we ask for bail, whether we seek to have that person incarcerated. Those issues are ultimately up to a judge, but we are the ones that decide whether to request it. And the list goes on, but we're here to talk about alternatives to arrest, so the rest of it, I'll sort of leave alone and go back to determining whether or not that discretion is used and how it's used. And I think ultimately we take particular risks every day when we're making those decisions. There's really no other way to say that. Every prosecutor that decides whether or not to do a particular thing is taking a risk one way or the other. And that discretion, unfortunately, and those risks are what's led to a lot of people just playing it, quote unquote safe and just overcharging and making those decisions to protect themselves, because every prosecutor's worst nightmare or worst thought is that they won't charge somebody and that person will go out and do something really horrible and that will fall on them. And so we've, as a collective profession, often just decide to do it and take the chances without recognizing the harms that come with that. So when we're talking about a charge that comes to us, that's where we sort of come in. But before that, the law enforcement agencies are all interacting with these individuals, and they also have a lot of discretion. What police respond to can be an agency decision. It can be a city council decision. It can be obviously decided by the legislature as to what things are going to be crimes or not crimes. But whether or not police do respond, how many respond, whether or not an officer conducts a traffic stop at all, whether they decide during that traffic stop to issue a ticket, whether they decide to do a search, whether they decide to make an arrest and take somebody physically into custody versus issuing somebody a citation, whether or not they perform a in-person search, not just their car, whether they use force, whether or not they send a case to a restorative justice panel, and whether or not, arguably the most important, they do anything at all, is up to police, and it is within their discretion. It is important, I think, to understand that a majority of these cases in the criminal legal system are misdemeanor cases. Most of our system is made up of misdemeanors that stem from minor infractions or minor encounters with individuals in our community. And they take up an incredible amount of time and resources for law enforcement officers with very little beneficial outcome within the legal system. In fact, there are some studies that have recently been done saying that people being charged with misdemeanors actually, and bringing them into the system, actually makes them more likely to commit further crimes than doing nothing at all, leaving them in the community, hopefully connecting them with some type of service, but that wasn't even required in the study that they did. My office can use our discretion not to charge a lot of these misdemeanor offenses, or we can use our discretion to divert them, but that doesn't solve the time and resources issue for the law enforcement agencies that are, and arguably makes it worse because they're spending these time and resources to investigate these cases and send them to us just for us to not charge them. These are things like unlawful trespasses, going to City Market, for example, when they have a trespass order, retail thefts, but without any restitution. A person never even gets outside of the door and the stuff is brought back. Driving with suspended licenses, those types of things. They are a lot of work for law enforcement. They take up a lot of time, and we're not currently charging them. And even when we do, we don't have a good beneficial outcome. The data does not support continuously prosecuting those cases, So I'm not really sure if there was a particular ask in coming here, but I do think it's important that we, as a community, encourage and allow officers to use their discretion on these cases. I think it would be incredibly beneficial to the community, but it'll also be beneficial to the system as a whole because law enforcement will have so much more time to invest in much more serious offenses, as many of you know we are dealing with in Burlington currently. To the extent that they do continue to respond and feel a need to do something, my office continuously encourages officers, not just in Burlington, but countywide, to send cases through some other restorative process, either to the Burlington Community Justice Center or to use the Parallel Justice Center. Both are fabulous programs in Burlington. And Rachel Jolly and her team are doing really great work to make sure that people are held accountable in a way that just looks different to what we are used to. But again, there's incredible data to show that restorative justice has much greater outcomes, much more beneficial outcomes than punitive justice. And that includes victim satisfaction. 88% of victims that go through a restorative process are satisfied with that process versus, I believe, 26% of people that go through the legal system. So this idea that sending cases through a restorative process isn't best for victims is not just false based on my own experience, but it is false based on the data. I also think it's really important to stress that and encourage officers to use creative outcomes and creative responses to some of these cases. The pandemic has forced this in a way that I think has been really beneficial to a lot of agencies. I can say for sure that there are several agencies in Chittenden County who have done some really cool things. An agency that responded to a retail theft for a man stealing food, and instead of writing any paperwork or citing the person for retail theft, the officer brought him back to the station, called a bunch of places for him, got him a job. He had lost his job from COVID, got him a job within a couple of hours, and the man started that job the next week. He's still there 18 months later, doing really well. We were never a part of that case. I actually only heard about it because the store that he had been stealing from, a friend of a friend, I know them, and they told me the story. Another officer who pulled somebody over, they were suspended, had a suspended license. He offered roadside to call DMV and Judicial Bureau. That is an absolute nightmare, I can tell you, trying to call either of them, and spent quite a long time trying to get this guy's license, figuring out what he needed, got him on a payment plan and got his license reinstated, and then didn't send us the paperwork. An individual whose bike was stolen went around to some community members and asked if they'd be willing to help buy this person a new bike because he needed it for work, and the community responded, and they bought this person a new bike. Somebody was being evicted and refusing to leave, and law enforcement agencies called legal aid, got this person legal representation to help them stay in this housing unit. Those are just examples. It's more work, and I recognize that, but in those moments, if we are responding to these things, the community responds back. They notice these things, they appreciate them, and like I said, none of those individuals have been in the system, have been back. The basic need was met or taken care of, or the underlying issue was addressed, and our legal system didn't have to be involved. So I think that's all I necessarily wanted to say. I'm happy to answer any questions about all of this. I also fully recognize that different agencies have different policies and also have different resources. I know that there are occasions where South Burlington will connect with Burlington on a particular resource or service. That isn't always as easy in some departments with smaller agencies or that don't know all of the different services, but it is happening behind the scenes, and I think we should be encouraging those types of responses over sending cases to us that we really can't do much about. I also would just, because of COVID, my office has declined over 1,000 cases since COVID, and I think if we were to start charging those cases again, it will be months and months, if not close to a year, before any of those misdemeanors are actually resolved in our courthouse right now, given the backlog. So, I think that this is a timely issue to really be figuring out how else we can respond to them, because even if we started charging these cases again, it is not going to solve the problem. It is not going to address accountability, and it is not going to get people their basic needs met in anytime soon. So I'm always open and welcoming of suggestions, and I always encourage officers to do that as well.
All right, thank you very much for that. The floor is open to commissioners to ask Citizen Attorney George any questions.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your time this evening. Also, I want to thank you for speaking up about, mental health funding, right? We've been pulling money away from programs and services for such a long time, and we're paying for it right now. A lot of concerns that we hear about, especially in this immediate area, the downtown area, have to do with individuals who have mental health issues or who are committing quality of life, quote unquote, that general term to describe a variety of behaviors that make people uncomfortable. There have been some behaviors that I've seen that don't make people feel safe. But I just wanted to have an idea about something like retail theft. And when someone is caught doing retail theft and they're habitual and they know they won't get a certain charge, this is a very common complaint that we hear over and over again from the downtown businesses. So I was just wondering if you can comment on that a little bit, because when you talk about restorative and working with the businesses and repayments occurring, I'm just trying to gauge, I don't want to use the word valid because I think the complaint is a valid complaint.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I agree that certain things shouldn't be overcharged, right? Because it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. So if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I don't know that valid's the right word, but I appreciate the concern from business owners, and I think it is happening. There are people that will continuously steal from businesses, sometimes getting away with the stuff and sometimes not, and some of them are large amounts of money loss to the businesses. I don't think that from my perspective, the question isn't necessarily, is this a real issue? The question is, how can we actually stop this from happening? And we've shown that charging people criminally with a retail theft when that's how people are getting by isn't a deterrent. And especially when it is 8 to 10 weeks from the time they steal the items to their first arraignment, they might have done it multiple other times in between. And even then, at arraignment, they're given, a condition of release not to go back to that business. So they go to another business. I guess my point is the criminal legal system isn't the answer. It's not doing anything that will actually prevent the behavior. You could slap fines on those individuals or make them pay the restitution, but the reason they're stealing from the beginning is they don't have any money. There are some people that might be doing it as some bigger scheme to make money. Most people are stealing it and trading it for things of value or for drugs. Those are not individuals that are capable of paying these big fines or even paying the restitution. And that's all the system can do. Those are our tools that we have, is we either fine people and give them convictions or we put them in jail. Neither of those solve the problem. Those people are just then more disenfranchised when they come out of our system and are more likely to continue to steal things. So I would love for us to really find ways. One, I don't know how many businesses are doing this, but I have recently learned that some businesses give their loss prevention officers essentially I can't think of the word. They will give them a bonus or extra money if they arrest or if they find somebody stealing. And my understanding from some of these policies is, I want to try to figure out what this actual policy is, and in particular, a couple of places that I've heard, but it essentially favors somebody leaving with the item, which doesn't make any sense in theory, which is why I can't imagine that would be anybody's actual policy. But I think a bigger question for a lot of these businesses is how to not allow people, like some places it is very easy to do and some places it is very hard to do. And in most of these places, they know the people. You know, I mean, you can read these affidavits and the loss prevention officers know all of these people and they will watch them walk all around the store, steal items, leave, and then call the police. So I do think there's got to be a different way to be addressing it from the get-go. But then again, I think beyond that, there needs to be a way to just figure out from most of these people the rule, not the exceptions of why are you doing this and what can we do to help you? What do you need? Because most of them just need food. They need money. They need basic needs met, and they don't need more criminal convictions on their record that will then make it harder for them to get jobs and get food and get money. So that's a long way of saying I appreciate the issue, but like many things, it has been an issue that has fallen into the criminal legal system to fix, and we're not doing it. We're not good at it because our only options are punitive and they cost the person money. So if you're talking about any quote unquote quality of life crime that you want to then respond with fines and more money, isn't going to work. It's going to fail every time, and it's failing every time.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Hi there.
Hi.
It sounds to me, I'm a social worker, right? So it sounds to me like what we really could use in our community, since we've been saying over and over that we're not solving problems because both the schools and the prosecutorial systems are overloaded and they can't actually resolve the issues. They become the kitchen sink of our society,
Yep.
so to speak. It seems like it might be really a good time to have a community summit and bring together all the partners that are involved in this, the social service agencies, the business people, your folks, the police department, others, to really talk about this in the mayor's office, because we're trying to resolve the issue in silos, and it just doesn't work, right? That's the big message, I think, right now in our world, is we can no longer use a silo approach to anything. That's the first thought. The second thing is, I'm interested in your observations and your vision for potential changes in the mental health system. And I use mental health system in quotes because it's sort of broken at this point. We're talking about a cahoots model. We have the street outreach folks, and we have, you know, other folks from Howard Center and others. Could you give us an idea of how you sort of rate what we're doing now as opposed to what we need to be doing, and talk about your own vision for what needs to happen?
Yeah. I have a lot to say about our mental health system, as if any of you follow anything that I've done lately, I spend most of my time fighting with the mental health system. I think that it is also one place where, there's several, but this is a big place where law enforcement and I are on total agreement that we don't have the capacity, nor should we have the capacity in the legal system to be dealing with a lot of these individuals' needs. And the Department of Mental Health and a lot of our mental health services that are sort of underneath that and are run by very large corporations or nonprofits, but with a lot of money behind them, are not doing what I think they should be doing. And some of that might be their own resource issues. I'm not saying that isn't, but every single time when they don't have the capacity, it is put on law enforcement and therefore put on us. And that is the last place it should be. It exacerbates most of these individuals' symptoms, and especially when law enforcement are having to respond repeatedly to people who are not in their right state of mind and are probably scared of most people coming into their spaces, let alone law enforcement agents. And then again, they're cited for a particular crime for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks out, and we're expected to then fix that. A lot of times, law enforcement is called for people in mental health crises at the hospital, some in the mental health ward, in SHEP 6 at the hospital, and they're acting out, they're assaulting somebody, or they are throwing things and breaking things, and they call law enforcement to charge them with a crime when some of them are on an involuntary hold at the hospital, meaning they're obviously not competent to be standing trial. They are probably not sane at the time of the offense. and yet our immediate response is to call police and then put them in through the court system, which ultimately will get an evaluation done, and they will be found not competent, and then we have to put them on an order of non-hospitalization and put them in the custody of the Department of Mental Health, but 9 months later. So we're not the answer to it. I understand that there are some people who commit crimes who also have mental health issues. That's a lot of people in our system. I'm not saying that anybody with a mental health issue shouldn't be prosecuted with a crime. But there are a lot of people, and it seems like a growing amount of people, whose mental health issue is the cause of their crime. It is what has led them to criminal behavior, and it is often means that they are not competent or not sane at the time. We literally can't prosecute them, but police continue to get called to the same people. I get into arguments with the Department of Mental Health every week because we have people on orders of non-hospitalization, meaning that they are in the custody of the Department of Mental Health and they do nothing to service them. And when we reach out and ask why this person isn't being serviced, or even more so, why they haven't been taken into custody and put on an order of hospitalization, we get excuse after excuse, been told that they aren't a risk to the public, even though they're committing crimes every day. Some of them are suicidal and talking about FBI reading their mail, and the Department of Mental Health is telling us they don't meet criteria, or telling us that they're not going to service them because the person doesn't want services. Well, most people, again, with mental health issues, especially the more significant ones, don't want services. But they want us to put them in jail. So I guess the really short answer is that I think I'm trying constantly to just push back and trying to, again, be on the same side of this with law enforcement to say law enforcement shouldn't be responding to these issues. But I will also acknowledge that when we say law enforcement shouldn't be responding to mental health calls, social workers should be, that there are a lot of social workers who will say, I'm not going to that call without law enforcement. Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do from the ground, before law enforcement's even involved in making social workers feel safe. That doesn't involve bringing weapons with them, or people that might have to then arrest them or be put in situations to harm them. And I think if we really do that and we start to get more and more community-based organizations involved, it will come, but a lot of it is just the mental health system, Department of Mental Health have gotten really used to pushing back on us and putting it on the criminal legal system, and we've done it. We've done it for them for a really long time. We've done it poorly, but we've done it. And so we have to, I think, prosecutors have a really big obligation to start saying, no, we're not doing this. And they are, for the people, especially that are already in their custody, saying, this person is in your custody, they are your responsibility, not ours. The few times that we've done that, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I have one woman who I put on ONH. I think I put her on 3 different ONHs for really low-level misdemeanors. BPD was responding to calls on her through the pandemic, weekly, if not more often than that, and I would send every single one of those cases to the Department of Mental Health and say, this person is, still committing crimes, like what are you doing for her? Is she engaging in services? Just to find out that they discharged her from her order a week after I put her on it because she didn't want to engage in services. And, about a month or 2 ago, she stabbed somebody in Burlington. Those are cases where police and prosecutors are getting, for lack of a better word, the sort of blame. Mm-hmm. And it is 100%, in my opinion, on the Department of Mental Health. They failed this woman, and they then failed this victim and this community because they didn't provide her with the services they had, and they didn't use the authority that they had to do it, to force it. And we need more beds.
Yeah.
And, I also
I'm
appreciate.
sorry, we need more what?
Beds. We need more long-term beds. The emergency room is not an appropriate place for people to be held on involuntary hold. It's dangerous for anybody else there. It's dangerous for their staff. And, I know Dr. Loeffler is very frustrated by that, and I don't blame him. I think that the Department of Mental Health has an obligation to have enough beds to hold people who are unsafe to themselves or to others. And right now they have, there's a lot of beds that are still not being used. And I think they need to do more to get enough beds to serve the state. And we also need more long-term facilities for individuals. We are often having to send people out of state for more longer term, and if they don't have their own health care, that's coming out of pockets of their families, and we all know, that is not the majority of the folks that we're dealing with that have that kind of money or resources. We need a facility like Phoenix House. We're sending people to New Hampshire. We need to be able to house those people here.
Thank you.
That's like,
I know,
the
that's
tip.
the surface, but at least we're getting there.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. As somebody who's born and raised here in Burlington, and I've been on the streets growing up and whatnot, what I'm seeing today is a lot of drug issues, a lot worse than it ever was when I was growing up. I mean, you just walk down the street or you drive down the street and you see drug activity. And I'm just wondering, what is the court system doing to help kind of lead these folks with these drug problems, which I think have a lot to do with some of the crimes that we're seeing today, into getting help, the help they need, and making sure they get that help. Can you just elaborate on that, if you could?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue. It's not really a simple answer, but if it is an individual who is just possessing a drug, then we're not doing a lot about it. We're doing what we can to connect them with services, but we can't force somebody to get substance use services. And even if we tried, the data suggests it doesn't work. Recovery is very short, if at all, if it's forced. People really need to want to stop using drugs. And not to make this more about mental health, but a lot of people use drugs to cover up for trauma. And we don't have the trauma services and mental health services that those folks need. So we are essentially asking people to stop using drugs, or they're going to get charged, or we're going to put them through the court system without providing the underlying mental health service that they need that led them to use the drugs. So if you imagine trying to do that yourself, for people, it's a lot easier for a lot of people, I think, to imagine or to swallow if you think about it with alcohol. If an individual is using alcohol to get over a bad breakup or to, anything, a death in the family, and we just tell them they can't drink anymore, it doesn't take care of the fact that they are struggling with this underlying mental health issue. That, if you want to talk about more drugs in the community, we are seeing a lot more suicides, in my opinion, lately than ever, and young people. So, that to me is a much bigger concern, and I'm not saying that people using drugs isn't a concern, but the people that are using drugs are either using it, and their only crime in a lot of cases is the possession of the drug. And then there are people who are committing burglaries and much more serious offenses because of a drug addiction or over drugs much more often. And we're charging those cases. I think that there's a big difference between the two. Sending somebody through the legal system because they're possessing a drug doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't work. That's again, not really, those people need the service. They need whatever services they might need. And the system, yeah, we can probably get them there eventually, but my preference would be that if somebody is found with drugs, they are connected immediately with a co-occurring wraparound service program that has mental health services and substance use services that they can go to and address both with people who understand that they might not immediately stop using the drugs until they've addressed this underlying mental health issue. But the other folks that are out there committing really violent offenses because of their drug use, we're charging those. And in some of those cases, those individuals are going to jail. And in some of those cases, they're going through our treatment court. But either way, they aren't using while they're in jail. Well, the hope at least is that they're not using while they're in jail. And if they're going through treatment court, it's actually far harder. Our treatment court is really, it's really hard. People can't work during it because of how much time it takes and how much effort. But a lot of the individuals, that we see on the street that maybe have open drug use, the police might know those individuals, but a lot of them don't commit other crimes. We don't see them in our system.
Well, I mean, they kind of are when people are, ODing and, being brought back to life. I mean, it happens all the time, so these people are out in the street dealing these drugs and killing people.
The dealers, yeah.
The dealers
Yeah, absolutely. And we are charging sales, people who are selling drugs, we're still charging those. Again, exceptions versus the rule, though, a lot of people who are selling drugs are also using drugs, and they're selling to support their own habit. Then there are others who are selling to make a living. All of those cases are very different. Law enforcement does a really great job at determining, in their investigations, which is which, and that's usually what tends to sort of focus our resolution. It doesn't mean we're not charging those individuals, but the individuals who are selling drugs to support their own habits are usually the individuals that will end up in our treatment court versus individuals that don't have a drug habit and are just selling. Those are usually the ones that are ending up in jail.
Thank you.
I'm not saying, none of it's working great. I don't, and a lot of people say that our system is broken. I often say I don't think it is. I think this is how it was designed. It just isn't. It doesn't work in the way that we were told it will work. It works in punishment and it works in punitive responses, but in terms of actual good outcomes for the humans involved, not just the people charged, but the victims, we don't do that very well. And we have a lot of work to do to get to that point.
True. Thank you.
Thank you. It's all really been illuminating. A couple of things. One, with regard to the discussion around mental health, it strikes me that even if we were to adopt a cahoots model, if we were to get new beds and so on and so forth, that's still going to take a very long time, and that we have to think about the next couple of years where we won't have those things in place. And so I just want to second Commissioner Comerford's idea about a summit, if you will, just in the way that we addressed COVID with community partners in a collective way. It seems to me that this is something that also requires our attention and can alleviate some of the burden on officers who, as you've said, themselves don't, understand that this is a burden that shouldn't be directed towards them. I wonder if you could, you mentioned the Parallel Justice Center, and you just mentioned treatment court, and of course the CJC, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, but could you just describe each of those and how they play a different role?
Yeah, so Parallel Justice Center, I believe South Burlington just started one as well, but before that, Burlington was the only Parallel Justice Center in the county. And it is essentially a way for individuals who are victims of crime, but that a crime hasn't been charged, to have some needs met. Whether or not an individual, for example, has their tires slashed or a window broken on their car, but law enforcement hasn't been able to determine who it was, or maybe no, they won't be able to determine who it was. Those individuals, law enforcement can, or I will send to the Parallel Justice Center, and they have some money and resources to help that person get a new tire, or have their window replaced, those types of things. Sometimes it is a victim of a burglary or even a domestic assault where they can't find the offender or they don't know who it is, wanting new locks on their doors to make them feel more safe. They can go to the Parallel Justice Center and they'll help them buy new locks or replace their locks or get a security camera, those types of things. So it's a really, really great community service or resource for individuals who are victims, but there is no offender charged. My view for that is really to expand that to not necessarily just victims where an offender isn't, like we don't know who the offender is, but maybe in some of these cases, like these retail thefts where we do, but we also know that the victim isn't going to get their money back from charging that person. And so maybe using the Parallel Justice Center for more of that to alleviate the harm, some of the harm to victims without needing to bring an individual into the system that we know won't actually alleviate that harm. And then treatment court is, you have to be charged with a criminal offense and you actually have to plead guilty to the criminal offense in order to enter our treatment court. We have a track that is for crimes that are fueled by drug use, and then we have a track that is crimes fueled by mental health issues, and then we have a sort of co-occurring track. And they're separate teams. There is a prosecutor and a defense attorney assigned, and there is the same judge is assigned to all of them. But there are caseworkers assigned to an individual. And again, they do have to plead guilty in order to go into it, so they're immediately taking accountability. And while their case, before they're sentenced, they engage in really intense treatment. They come to court every week, sometimes every other week if they're doing well. They meet with their caseworkers. They have to do UAs every week or every other week if it is a drug issue. If it's a mental health issue, they have to check in with certain aspects. Like I said, it's a lot of work. If an individual chooses to do it, judges usually go through a long dialogue with them about how, frankly, probation would be easier. Furlough is sometimes easier than going through our treatment court. The benefit, if you do it, obviously the biggest benefit is that you are usually in recovery or doing well when you graduate. That's, of course, our goal, but also that you don't end up in jail or on probation. You usually have a sort of time-served sentence and you are able to go. If you don't and you fail, for lack of a better word, our treatment court, then you serve the underlying sentence in jail. So there is a very big punitive response if you don't engage, and people typically know that. And there's been ebbs or highs and lows for our particular treatment court. You really need the right people involved. There's been years since when I was first a prosecutor, that the team really wasn't great, and a lot of people weren't held accountable. And when the program doesn't do well, law enforcement will lose a lot of trust in it. The prosecutors will lose trust in it. The community loses trust in it. It's really important, like our community justice centers, that the people hold them accountable and do a really good job so that the community can feel safer having people engage in it. And right now we have a fantastic team, and they really did some miraculous things to keep people engaged during COVID, because for a lot of these folks, doing virtual anything was not a possibility or was much harder, and for some of them it was amazing. It was really great for them to not have to, for certain anxieties or other issues, to not have to come in. But those are the differences.
Can you say something about the Community Justice Center as well?
Yeah, so every town has, they might not have their own community justice center, but they have access to one. There are some that serve multiple towns, for example. But if you commit an offense in any town in Chittenden County, there is a community justice center available to you or available to us to send them, or to law enforcement. They can do direct referrals to these community justice centers. And it is a restorative approach. So the individual would be asked to come in and They do have to immediately take accountability. They have to take responsibility for the conduct. The victims of the crime can be involved, but they don't have to be. If they are involved, then they can meet with the offender. I can tell you a lot of people that are victims of crimes, especially when it's a random person, they just want to know why. They want to hear from the person why they did it and how they're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And our system does not allow for that. Victims and offenders are not allowed to talk during cases pending. In fact, they are usually charged with a new crime if they do talk to the victim. And even at the change of plea, they usually say very little. Their attorney does all the talking. The prosecutor does all the talking. There's really no dialogue between the victim and offenders. So in this, there is, if the victim wants it. They can have whatever dialogue they want, ask all the questions they want, and the offender has to answer them. And if they don't, and they don't fully engage, then they get sent back to our office for prosecution. And otherwise, whether a victim is involved or not, there are volunteers from each community that make up a panel. And if the victim isn't asking those questions, then this panel does on their behalf to sort of account for why this person did a particular thing, and they can ask them to do certain things to sort of account for it, to repair the harm. So that might be something as small as a letter of apology, or it can be a donation to charities, or it can be community service, or it can be PowerPoint presentations to schools. I've seen some of them do that. It's really great. They can come up with anything, and as long as the person who's committed the crime agrees to it and succeeds and does what's asked of them, then again, they are not criminally charged.
Thanks. Would all three of those count as diversion programs? So when people refer to diversion programs, would it include all three of those?
I think that in the sort of somewhat layman's terms, I don't mean that as then yes, I guess so. Treatment court, not so much, because they are pleading guilty. So in that sense, I would say no. The true diversion, there is an actual program called Diversion and an actual program called Tamarack. Those are people that we do actually take the paperwork from law enforcement and we charge it, but then we send it to these programs. They do what's asked of them, and then if they don't complete it, it's already charged and it just goes into the system. So that's a true diversion program, but in reality, yes, the parallel justice, again, not so much because the offender isn't involved in that, but CJC could be considered you are diverting it. You're diverting it from the criminal legal system, and that's technically all that should be required of a diversion program.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Yeah.
So could you give us your assessment of how well we're doing in the criminal justice system with our neighbors in the New American community?
Not really. I mean, I can tell you that it is definitely an area that needs improvement. I can say personally, when I first became a prosecutor, I did the domestic violence docket for 3 years, and that was a particular area where I felt we were really failing our New American community members, because those charges, even, let alone convictions, have drastic consequences that most folks in our community don't have. Not to minimize the consequences of a domestic case, but we were asking them to come into this court system, asking victims to be a part of a system they did not trust, and surrounded by a language they did not know. And our access to interpreters was very slim. We usually had one interpreter that was dealing with all of the individuals involved, the people charged and the victims, sometimes the parents or and then we're also sending their kids through the DCF process with very little outcome, very little good outcome, because there was no programs that they could do. There was one program called Connecting Cultures at UVM that was fantastic, but they were overwhelmed with how many cases they were getting. And we didn't have, I actually remember at the time I really wanted to do a sort of treatment court, but for new Americans, where we had a dedicated team of people that would work with them and their community. That obviously never worked out, but I think in particular cases like that, in domestic cases, I don't think we're doing a very good job. I think in other cases where there isn't quite so many complicated factors, we're doing okay.
So
We need more interpreters, and we need more impartial interpreters. It's a very small community, and even our interpreters know all of the parties involved, which creates a lot of anxiety for the folks that we're dealing with.
So where do we go from here with that population? If we need to do more work, what's the
Yeah.
work that needs to be done besides interpreters?
I think that I know Sandy Baird, bless her heart, is doing a lot of work with really just trying to educate a lot of them about law enforcement responses, DCF responses, what their rights are, what the laws are, what the kind of community expectations are around certain behaviors. But she can't do it herself. I think that more community forums in those communities with giving them the information that they need in their language from people that don't know them necessarily, but are a part of the larger community, could go a long way for them, because a lot of people will just immediately think they're in trouble or think that something is going to happen with them with immigration if they are involved at all, or that that's going to happen to their partner, which is incredibly terrifying, and it doesn't allow for us to address the harm.
I hope if we do end up having a summit, that I'm hoping you're going to take some leadership on in your spare time, that we do include the leadership of those communities.
Absolutely.
Because they're the ones who are staying and they're raising their children here. And I think they would really add to the conversation.
Absolutely, and I sort of went off on the domestic aspect just because that was more of my experience, but the mental health aspect is a very real one for that community as well, and even less services. We're talking about having limited services for folks who do speak English and look like me. They're much fewer for people who do not speak English and don't understand our system.
Thank you very much.
I guess I would have one
Sorry,
more
just
question.
want to let you know that Professor Gross is waiting to come on in a couple of minutes, so just to let you know.
Thank you. What can people do in terms of getting the message to our representatives in the State House? Like, what kind of actions would you want to see people in the community do to help get more resources, to help get more attention paid by the mental health system? Are there some things, like if you were queen for a day, what would you make happen?
I think that, going back to, is it Comerford?
Yes.
Comerford? Ms. Comerford's comment, I do think that the more community, as a bigger voice, is much more powerful. If this is a community demanding a certain thing versus an individual, it will have a lot more impact. I know there's some press here today. Involving the press in those conversations is incredibly important, because I think that me sending emails every once in a while to the Department of Mental Health doesn't have the impact that me making a very public statement about the Department of Mental Health has on the news, or even in committees or forums like this. But it's just me, and not that I'm the only one speaking out about it. Mark Redmond at Spectrum is screaming from the rooftop about these things, and how it's impacting our youth in this community. But we're all just individuals saying these things. So
my hope would be to do something where we come together as a community and we do find those couple of things. We're not going to agree on everything, and that's okay, but coming up with a few things that we are just demanding that the state do, and also not just saying we need more beds, but really trying to think creatively about how we can do that, because there's nothing worse than people just saying do this, but not telling you how. It happens to me all the time, like, solve this. I don't have the tools to solve it, or I don't have the resources to solve it. So really making sure that it's a collective ask, or a full ask, where we're thinking about all of the, I'm sure I know most of the ways the Department of Mental Health or other mental health organizations are gonna say we can't do this, because I've heard them. So if we have all of those voices in a room and are coming up with it together and can know what those pushbacks are going to be and try to solve that for them, for their own good and ours. But my biggest hope would be that we have enough services that somebody can go up to a law enforcement officer or go up to the emergency room in crisis and immediately have a safe place, and it not be in a lobby of an emergency room, where they will be cared for, and they will be cared for until they no longer need it, instead of cared for overnight and then put back out on the streets for law enforcement to then pick up and bring back. I mean, I'm sure it happens all the time where cops come into contact with people and they're in clear mental health crisis, and so they bring them to UVM Medical Center, and 5 hours later, they're back out on the streets in clear mental health crisis. That, I think, is a resource issue. And I also, in some of the cases, think that it's just a misunderstanding of the law. So I do think that there are some clear legislative asks that can be a part of that, to either clarify a particular statute or to give certain resources where they should be and not where they currently are.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been, I think, very beneficial to us and to the public at large, and hang in there. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys for having me.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thanks.
All right, moving forward, agenda item 4.02. We have Professor Neil Gross via Zoom, and he's here to talk to us about police reform. So, Professor, thank you for being here very much, and the floor is yours.
So I'm happy to be here. My understanding is that you wanted me to say a few words about police reform around racial disparities in vehicle stops in particular. So that's what I've focused my short presentation on today. And if other things come up that you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to talk about those as well. So I'll start by way of a little bit of background. I'm a sociology professor here at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. Many years ago, in the early 90s, I was in law enforcement. I was a police officer in California for the city of Berkeley for a short time, and then went to graduate school, and have been working for the past few years on a book about police reform, on kind of what works and what doesn't, and what good policing looks like in America today. So the issue that I've been asked to talk about is racial disparities in vehicle stops, and my focus today is an article that I wrote, editorial for the New York Times, an op-ed back in the fall on this topic, outlining kind of the extent of the problem of racial disparities in vehicle stops and some possible solutions to that problem. I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to this topic. One of the cities that I'm studying for my research is heavily invested in a police reform strategy that I'm sure you're aware of, that's called procedural justice. It's the idea that that kind of things go better in a community in terms of relationships between law enforcement and the criminal justice system when people in the community have some sense of confidence, have a perception that they're being treated fairly and equitably by law enforcement, by prosecutors, by judges, and so on, and that if the aim is to produce a kind of just and equitable society, it's really important to focus not just on kind of just and equitable treatment of individuals, but also on perceptions of that just and equitable treatment. So lots of police departments over the years have been working up procedural justice reforms of one kind or another. And one of the cities that I'm studying had done that as well. But when I started to talk to people in the community about what procedural justice meant to them, what it looked like on a daily basis, one thing I heard very frequently was that the idea of procedural justice was well and good, but the main way that people interacted with the police wasn't through the kind of formal training sessions or dialogue sessions that the department had hosted between community members and the police. The main way that people came in contact with the police was by being pulled over. And in fact, that's one of the main ways that anybody comes in contact with the police. Police officers in the US make around 19 million vehicle stops a year, which is an extraordinary number. And again, that is one of the main forms of interaction that citizens have with law enforcement. It's not waving to the officer as they drive by the street. It's not calling an officer to report a crime. It's being pulled over for an offense and possibly receiving a ticket. And the data on this really align with the experiences of the people and I talked to. And the data show that in this country, Black Americans and Latino Americans, but in particular Black Americans, are pulled over at a much higher rate than white Americans. And this isn't a single city problem. It's a national problem. The data that look at this use a whole variety of methods, and depending on which method you use, the magnitude of the disparities vary. But on average, the evidence suggests that Black Americans are pulled over about 40%, 43%. They're about 43% more likely to be pulled over than, for example, their white counterparts. And it's not only that Black Americans are more likely to be pulled over, their cars are on average about twice as likely to be searched, even though the hit rates, the rates at which contraband are found in those cars are either no different than white Americans on average or lower than for white Americans. So there's a great deal of intrusiveness in vehicle stops of Black Americans. But there's more to it than that. We all know the ways in which vehicle stops can quickly escalate into situations of violence. And beyond that, I'll say, just based on a number of studies and certainly many interviews that I've conducted, it's the case that being pulled over on a really frequent basis for no real reason at all is frustrating, maddening, terrifying, and conveys nothing so much as that one doesn't have sort of the full protection, the full rights under the law. And so it's a huge problem, and this is not news to anybody, I would think at this point, but it's a really significant aspect of the problem with racial inequality in policing. It's not that the use of force aspects aren't also significant, but they're partially connected to vehicle stops and separate anyway from them. The vehicle stops are just this huge issue. They, of course, make it much harder for people to travel to work if they're fear getting pulled over, and there are many other ways in which these disparities just impinge upon people's lives. So I started doing some research on solutions. Been teaching a course about the police for some time now. So I knew some of this already. But I was looking for kind of practical solutions. What things could cities actually implement as opposed to kind of pie in the sky plans? I started looking at things that didn't seem to me to be terribly useful as far as solutions go. One is, at least as concerns vehicle stops, is implicit bias training. This is something, of course, that many police departments have invested in quite heavily, as have many corporations and other organizations throughout the country. The idea would be that someone comes in and gives a training or a series of trainings to hopefully reduce implicit biases. The thought being that it's those biases that drive the disparities, which they may well. From my standpoint as a sociologist looking at the data, I haven't seen any evidence that implicit bias trainings are effective in reducing racial disparities in law enforcement, despite their really widespread implementation. There's evidence from other areas of organizational life that this kind of training actually, in some instances, makes biases worse because it either makes people angry that they're being told that they have biases, which can activate their biases more. And in other instances, it gives people in organizations the false illusion that their organizations are now bias-free, and that can actually exacerbate bias. So I've not seen good evidence that implicit bias, at least as it's currently formulated, implicit bias training is terribly effective in this regard. That's one solution people have talked about. Another one that I think has come up quite frequently in recent conversations has been the shift to some kind of automated enforcement for vehicle stops, for traffic offenses. So can you use more red light cameras, for example, to give tickets, or other kinds of automated technologies? I think these have their place. I think that there are challenges with implementing them, and there start to be, I think, other problems that arise when cities rely too heavily on these kind of technologies. One of them being that when you eliminate discretion on the part of officers, that may reduce the potential for bias. But if everybody who's driving 2 miles an hour over the speed limit gets a ticket automatically, all of a sudden you've got a huge number of tickets given out in the community, and that's not a good thing. Certainly other places now, other cities and states are considering other alternatives. Some are asking police departments to get out of the traffic enforcement business altogether. In the department that I used to work for in Berkeley, there's a move afoot to try to get civilians who don't work for the police department to do traffic enforcement. I'm not sure whether that is going to come to pass or not. And other cities and states are directing their officers to stop making stops for minor equipment violations, for tail lights out, for example, or license plate lights out. I think these have some potential. I suppose the reduction of stops for these minor offenses could be useful, but it's also the case that vehicle codes have to be enforced, and it's not clear who else is going to be doing that enforcement and doing it well. So 3 other solutions, as I was doing the research, seem to me to be much more promising as possibilities, and it's those that I'll talk through a little bit more, and then happy to open it up to questions for you. So the first one that I discussed in this article is reducing or potentially banning the use of pretextual stops. So pretext stops, as people know, are stops where an officer might suspect that a driver of a car is involved in criminal activity, but where the officer doesn't have probable cause to make a stop on the basis of that suspicion. And so instead, the officer notes a minor traffic violation, perhaps an equipment violation, or a failure to come to a full stop at a stop sign, makes the stop, which is legal, but the real purpose is not to enforce the traffic law; it's to then investigate the driver for criminal activity. There's some good evidence that that pretextual stops are a significant contributing factor to racial disparities in vehicle stops. There have been a couple of sort of natural experiments that have been conducted where departments have been first disallowed and then allowed to do pretextual stops. And when that's happened, racial disparities in stops have gone up. So it seems that pretextual stops are an occasion for officers to, in some instances, rely on underlying biases to make stops. So, one possibility would be to dramatically scale back the use of pretextual stops. In conversations I've had with law enforcement officers and executives, there's been some real sense of being uncomfortable with the idea of banning pretextual stops. It is sometimes the case that that officers go on kind of racially motivated fishing expeditions, and certainly those kinds of stops have no place whatsoever in law enforcement. It is also sometimes the case that officers will have some level of information or intelligence about the occupant or occupants of a vehicle that lead them to have real reason to believe that there may be criminal activity taking place, but where that level of suspicion goes beyond a hunch, but doesn't yet meet the standard of probable cause. And sometimes those stops do result in finding contraband, finding narcotics, for example, or finding weapons. So some chiefs that I've talked to have acknowledged that greatly reducing pretextual stops might be viable. Banning them outright, they tend to be more uncomfortable with in the interests of preserving public safety, which seems to me to be a reasonable idea. So that would be one suggestion, right? Think about dramatically scaling back the use of pretextual stops. Build that into the policy of the department. Build that also into the organizational culture of the department, into field training that officers receive. That we don't do pretextual stops here unless the circumstances really warrant it. And I think that could have a pretty significant and beneficial effect. A second option that I discussed briefly in that piece is and I don't know the current policies in Burlington, is requiring written consent for vehicle searches. This isn't directly related to pretextual stops, but it sort of speaks to whether officers are incentivized or disincentivized to conduct them. In many stops that are pretextual, the officers have as their ultimate aim to see whether there's anything going on in the car. And if they don't have probable cause to search the car, they'll ask for consent. It's common, of course, for people to give consent, even though in these circumstances they typically don't have to. People feel that the power dynamics are such that if they don't give consent, they will look suspicious. And there's some good social science evidence to suggest that when you require written consent, not just consent that's recorded on a body-worn camera, but an actual form where you're reading to the person, you don't have to agree to this, to this search, and it will not be seen as evidence against you that you don't allow the search. That makes it less likely that officers will stop cars on a pretextual kind of hunch basis. Because the whole process is more fraught for them. There's less likelihood that they'll actually be able to conduct a search. And they also then have to oftentimes justify to sergeants, why they stopped the person in the first place, why they're going through this whole rigmarole of having to get consent. So there's some evidence out of North Carolina, for example, that requiring written consent can be beneficial and can start to dial back some of those disparities. But there's another option that I'm equally hopeful about. And that's one that, to my knowledge, not many police departments are using. And that has to do with visibility and information. In many departments, and I don't know if it's the case in Burlington, data on disparities in police operations, whether they're traffic stops or pedestrian stops or arrests or use of force, those data are compiled on a quarterly, sometimes an annual basis. And even if they're available in some kind of real-time format on dashboards, they're often not available to officers. And yet, there's good evidence from research on discriminatory practices in hiring, for example, that when employees and especially managers have real-time data on how their employees are doing with respect to equity, that those managers become strongly motivated to get more equity into their work procedures and processes. So one possibility that I think could be quite intriguing would be to have it so that police departments are telling sergeants, patrol sergeants, on a weekly basis, look, here's how your shift is doing in terms of racial disparities in stops. Here's how you did this week. Here's how you compare to swing shift. And with then pressure put on sergeants from above to really bring down those numbers, make the traffic stop numbers, roughly proportional to the demographic composition of the city. I think that could be a very powerful move. With that information available, in a sense, sergeants and officers don't have any excuse anymore for continuing with the same procedures. They have it right there in front of them that there are these tremendous disparities, and there starts to be, again, real pressure put on supervisors to push their officers in different directions. I think there are other possibilities as well that I didn't discuss in the piece. In some cities, it's the case that racial disparities in vehicle stops are driven partially by police deployment patterns. So that in cities that are highly segregated, if you have many more police officers assigned to neighborhoods that, for example, have a higher concentration of Black people or Latino Americans, and if those officers are instructed to make a lot of stops, that will naturally create disproportionality in the overall patterns of stops in the city. So there are questions that can be raised about changing police deployment patterns as well. The reason I'm kind of favorable on these three policies I laid out is that I think that they could be accomplished without huge changes to police operations. I mean, getting rid of pretextual stops would definitely take some getting used to, I think, for cops, but I think it's doable. And I think that the other thing I'd add here, and I guess I'll direct this especially to those in law enforcement in the room. I think that folks in law enforcement also don't fully recognize how incredibly damaging it is to the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color that these racial disparities in stops exist. I mean, I think it's certainly well known outside law enforcement how damaging those patterns are. But I think that many in law enforcement are not fully cognizant of how much improved the relationship between law enforcement and various minority communities would be if those racial disproportionalities were diminished. It really is just something that is tremendously burdensome on many different communities and many different individuals, and departments would go a long way toward improving their relationship with the community and really toward improving both procedural justice and really justice if they could reduce those stops. So I'll stop there and happy to.
Thank you very much. I was very interested in some of the things that you said, in our area, we have actually dramatically reduced the number of traffic stops, but we still have issues. We have reporting that continues to show racial disparities. And I found some of the things that you mentioned, and I would like the chief to address a few things, because we've been kind of, we've not been moving forward with how do we address this ongoing issue. We as a commission were told that it was due to warrants, but then we've got some information back from our data team in the city that no, it's not due to warrants, it has to be something else. So we're not really getting to the root of it. And I do like the idea that you have of, looking at what's happening across different shifts, maybe down to specific officers. I don't know if that's an option, but could you expand on that a little bit more with just some other ideas of how to dig deeper in a way that, you're talking about not doing things that would cause huge changes to police operations, which is a very sensitive subject, but any other ideas that you have along those lines? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for those questions. I guess one thing I'll note is that it's common for departments to identify factors that they think are driving these disparities, and the factors that departments point to are often factors that are really specific to their departments. So you mentioned, the idea that there are lots of stops involving warrants, and that maybe that is what drives these disparities. The interesting thing from my perspective as someone who's kind of watched different departments respond to these issues over the years is that though different departments cite different factors, the overall numbers across the country are roughly the same. There is some variation from department to department, but these really specific department factors probably aren't the things that are driving the issue, right? There's probably some systemic issue here that's resulting in very similar patterns in different cities around the country. So that would be the first thing that I wanted to note. You mentioned the idea of kind of monitoring the performance of individual officers. And I think that there's I think that's also a kind of a sensitive issue. I think that we're now at the point where, in terms of technology, where some more of that monitoring might start to become a realistic possibility. For example, I don't know the situation with the body-worn cameras in Burlington. I know that in a number of cities, folks are using body-worn cameras that produce automated transcriptions of exchanges, and some cities are connecting those to pretty sophisticated computer algorithms that try to detect evidence of bias in interactions from those transcripts to try to flag officers who are engaged in biased behavior. This would be beyond vehicle stops, but to encompass all kinds of police operations. So I know that some cities are trying to set up sort of early warning systems to that effect, to identify officers who are kind of particularly biased with regard to this behavior. I think there are other possibilities that are coming online, some of which are also intriguing. A number of body-worn camera companies now have streaming body-worn cameras, which begin to raise privacy questions, but they allow a sergeant to be there virtually, potentially on any stop, on any interaction. And I think that raises some more possibilities for monitoring officer behavior. I think that starts to get really tricky, though, if the concern is with pushback. Employees in in most fields don't like having their bosses right there over their shoulders and being watched and monitored at every second. So I think that that starts to raise some issues. Partly for that reason, I guess I personally would favor looking at these data not at the individual level, but at the level of a shift. Right. So as a shift, patrol shift, we know that these we're just stopping, many more people of group X than of group Y, that doesn't square with the demographics of the city, and we're getting pressure from above to, be more like the next patrol team. I think that can be a much more effective kind of motivator, and doesn't, necessarily raise the same kinds of pushback as some other kinds of strategies. So that's what immediately comes to mind in response to your questions.
Thank you.
Hi, so you mentioned how implicit bias training is, you don't find it to be all that effective. What trainings do you see that are in fact have use and are useful? Because I feel there's almost like a big national push for it's like more training. So are there any in fact that you find based on your observations that are better than others?
So there may be some kinds of implicit bias training that are more effective than others. When it comes to law enforcement, I think there's some really interesting experimental work that's being done now. I think what doesn't seem to be very effective is putting cops in a room with someone who's lecturing or leading discussions for an hour. There may well be forms of training that involve putting yourself in a kind of a simulated environment in which the simulations are altered to try to disengage any biases. There's some evidence that those kinds of implicit bias trainings might end up being more effective. So I wouldn't want to rule these out entirely. When it comes to the issue of racial disparities in stops, it seems to me that there probably are kind of trainings that would matter. One thing that isn't directly about vehicle stops, but I think is quite helpful is conversations where officers are brought in a room with people who are affected by law enforcement, and in which the officers and the people who've been affected by the behavior of law enforcement talk openly and honestly about their experiences. That happens much less frequently than people would think, there's some quite good evidence that those kinds of kind of deep, meaningful exchanges can really start to shift perspectives, so that cops can start to realize what does it feel like to be stopped so frequently. I was talking to an interviewee not too long ago who described the experience of driving home with her husband from dinner. She and her husband had taken one car, and her two teenage sons had taken another car. And her two teenage sons, the family is black, and her two teenage sons were pulled over by officers for a minor equipment violation. And one SUV pulled up, and then another pulled up, and a third pulled up, screeching their tires. And she and her husband were just freaking out because they were terrified. And I think there is an inadequate understanding on the part of law enforcement about the extent to which that terror is real. So I think those kinds of dialogue trainings can be somewhat effective. But for me, when it comes to solving these kinds of problems, the solution is organizational, not training. The idea is, can sergeants put pressure on officers to reduce these disparities, right? Do something different. This is not okay. Change your behavior. Why are you making all these stops, right? Those kinds of things. And to do that, you need to have organizational incentives. The sergeants need to be, sort of their feet have to be held to the fire at command meetings. Like, okay, why is your shift doing so much worse than this other shift? Those are the kinds of incentives that can make a difference. I think for these things, it's policy change that probably matters more than individual trainings. At least that's my view.
Thank you very much. Chief Murad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much for being with us and sharing these ideas, Professor. So We do not do any searches without a written permission. So that's something that we've done pretty much always, certainly in the memory of officers who've been here longer than I. And pretextual stops are incredibly rare and really only occur when we have intelligence about the specific vehicle, so that we're looking it's an intelligence-driven stop, not a pretextual stop. We've actually been able to drive down our traffic stops over the past 6 years by 79%, but we have driven down the number of black drivers stopped only by 75%. So there does have a disparity that remains there. Basically, if our driving population's 8%, according to crash data, the number of stops that we conducted last year in 2020 was 10.7%. So 8%, 10.7%, there is a slight difference there. We're talking about very small numbers of drivers. We're talking about very small numbers of stops. And we're also talking about incidents that are spread across shifts. We do have certain officers who are more oriented towards traffic enforcement and are still driving it, since it has been made clear through the agency that traffic enforcement is not something that we prioritize with regard to interdiction or with regard to non-safety violations. So egregious driving is still going to cause an officer to pay attention and take action on that. The majority of the time, the officer doesn't know the identity of that driver. That is, you are seeing a car behave in a certain way, not a driver behave in a certain way. What we have seen, I think, is the importance of working here to try to find ways to make certain that our drivers across all groups have baselines that are equal when it comes to issues like suspended licenses. What we find is that if we remove suspended license from the picture, we actually issue tickets less often to drivers of color. If we, not in 2020, but that was the case in 2019 and 2018, whereas if we do factor in license suspension, which is something that we do have to address, we are not, we don't have the absolute immunity of, the speaker before you was our state's attorney who talked about the discretion not to do certain things in certain instances. She's got absolute immunity. We do not have that immunity, not as an agency and not as individual officers. And so when we encounter someone who is driving without a license or with a suspended license, there's certain things that we do have to do in order to address that situation in front of us. But we do make efforts to find other alternatives other than, for example, taking cars, which used to be far more common. We now tend to ground the vehicle and allow other people to come get it. Nevertheless, if you take that suspended license out of the picture, the rate at which we issue tickets actually reversed in 2018, 2019. In 2020, it went back up, crept up a little bit again. Warrants don't have anything to do with our vehicle stops. So warrants have to do with certain kinds of uses of force, but had nothing to do with our vehicle stops. I am really intrigued by this idea, however, of what you talked about, like organizational ideas and looking across shifts, et cetera. When you have such small numbers, you're not going to find those spikes. Those spikes are incredibly tiny. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are as to how to drill into those when they are so tiny and when they may not even exist across shifts.
Yeah, thanks. I do think that the situations of different departments is obviously going to be a bit different. I think that in a small agency, it may well be that there aren't these dramatic differences across shifts, as you mentioned. I think there can still be incentive structures in place that can be effective. So there could be a push from above, from you to all the sergeants to say, well, look, these are what the numbers are. Maybe there aren't huge differences across shifts. Let's be in a race to get those numbers down and to get the numbers looking like the numbers should from the standpoint of equity. How can we do that so that you are in a sense, pitting teams up against one another to see who can reach those equity goals fastest. That's one way of thinking about it. I think it starts to get very difficult when you're making those kinds of policies, because I think then it's, then are you encouraging officers, in fact, to look at race in their stops if you're trying to get more equity in the stops. I think that's a challenge. I guess I would just push back with tremendous respect on the pretext point. I have never been in a police department where unless pretext stops are banned outright, and in which the culture of the agency is we simply do not make stops. in which cops don't make pretextual stops. You know, this guy looks suspicious, let's light him up, is really common. And, you know, so I think that part of the organizational change, it sounds like maybe you're moving in the right direction or have gone a long way there anyway, but part of that is to, you know, reinforce that notion even more as part of the organizational, the culture of the place, right? You know, we're the Burlington Police Department. You know, some other agencies might make pretextual stops. We just don't do it. And, you know, and your FTOs teach that, and, you know, and it's, you know, drilled into officers from day one. You know, I think there's some reason to think that, that those kinds of organizational culture changes can also be effective. You know, I do think that you're pointing to something which is part of the issue here that we've not addressed, and that is that, you know, part of these disparities in stop patterns has something to do with socioeconomic status, or at least it can, if vehicles are in a state of disrepair and officers are making stops on that basis without seeing who's in the car, and if there's a correlation in a city between socioeconomic status and racial identity, then that might go some way toward accounting for these disparities. So, you know, I think there are lots of factors at play. You know, the bottom line, Chief, is that as I look at this, you know, police departments, when they, you know, really set their mind to solving a problem, can often do it very, very well. And it's a question of, you know, whether reducing these disparities becomes a prime focus for the agency, not just from the top, but, you know, at the middle ranks as well, all the way on down. You know, that also opens up the possibility for, you know, for line officers, for sergeants, for lieutenants to come up with their own ideas as to what might be effective in solving this problem, so that there's a lot of, you know, space, I think, for real organizational creativity there. You know, it's a question of whether departments are going to take this seriously as an issue and really forefront it and grapple with it head on. And, you know, I think if departments are going to do that, whether using these strategies or others, I think there's a decent chance that they can, you know, start to reduce some of these disparities. So that's I guess that's my thought in response to your comments.
Thank you. We don't have much time left for the professor, so I ask if any commissioners have questions, please ask them now.
I'll just make a brief comment. Hi, Professor Gross. It's Stephanie Seguino who contacted you. Nice to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think what you're describing is what we're grappling with here, and that is that we have traffic stop disparities, even though we stop many fewer cars, but the most notable disparities are in use of force. And the question becomes, what is the cause of that, and what's the solution to that? And I think that is where we are really struggling to all be on the same page. That is, we as a police commission and the police department. I think there's a difference of opinion on whether those disparities are justified or not. And from my point of view, the question is exploring more deeply what is leading to these disparities. And I'll give you an example. In the use of force data that we get, for example, police officers will identify whether they think the person is intoxicated or having a mental health episode and so forth. And so white use of force suspects are much more likely to be identified as having a mental health episode as compared to, for example, black use of force subjects. And it really, for me, really relates to some of the work by Philip Goff or Jennifer Eberhardt about the threat perception of blacks, that they're more perceived as more threatening and criminal. And so that's sort of where we're at. And I would maybe ask you to comment on that. And I appreciate your point about implicit bias training, and yet that is an example of implicit bias that we have to come to terms with. And how do we get there? And how do, you know, maybe if you have some thoughts also about how to, you know, productively work as a commission with the police department to provide the, you know, the prioritization on this in a way that's really constructive and not destructive.
Sure. So just to clarify, I do think that implicit bias is, as a process, is an important driver of disparities in vehicle stops and use of force. It's just that I haven't seen any evidence that training is an effective way to reduce those implicit biases. So it's so you have to put some organizational architecture in place to blunt their effect or to change the way they work. it's hard to kind of drill biases out of people. That doesn't seem to be very effective. Yeah, of course, I'll add that the point that should be fairly obvious that, but surprisingly isn't, which is that the more you can diversify the department itself, the more you reduce those biases. For some time, social scientists weren't sure whether having more diverse police forces would reduce the use of force, would reduce racial disparities in a whole range of things, from arrest to use of force. There's been some really fantastic studies by economists recently that I think show quite definitively that, in fact, that they do. And so, I think that's one way to kind of, and you can think of that as an organizational change as well that can reduce those disparities. I think the use of force piece is really complicated. I guess I'll just say two things off the bat. So the first, again, this won't come as a surprise to anybody, but I think the best evidence we have suggests that that the way to scale back use of force and also potentially to reduce disparities in use of force is through policy change. As agencies tighten up their policies on the circumstances in which force can be used, those tend to be quite effective over the long haul in dialing back uses of force. I would issue some caveats here. I think that kind of dramatic policy change imposed from outside agencies can tend to be very counterproductive, and so there's a way in which it's probably much better to, or at least there's a strong argument for incremental change that is really built in partnership and in cooperation with the agency, so that kind of everyone's on board as you're making the change. The question is, what are those changes going to look like? One thing I would note is that in conversations about use of force, there's kind of a crucial insight from social psychology that I think is sometimes ignored. It's built into some of the better sort of de-escalation training modules. There I think when it comes to kind of practical training can be actually quite effective, and it also relates to your idea of kind of threat perception, and it has to do with the idea of deference. It is a part of police culture. It's been part of police culture since studies of the police were first done in this country in the 1950s. That officers expect civilians to be. They may be acclimated to them not being like this, but that there's some expectation that civilians will defer to their commands. If I'm an officer and I ask you to do something, I expect you to do it. When that doesn't happen immediately, it can trigger a sense that something's up. Why isn't this person following my commands? What's going on? It can lead immediately to the perception that the person is a threat, and can trigger a whole range of responses when, in fact, the person may not want to defer to the officer's authority for a whole range of reasons, including long histories of abuse within that community or nationally. So trying to get officers to think seriously about what deference and the rejection of deference feels like, and how to dial back the natural response when deference is denied, which is to get upset that deference is denied. I think that's a really important part of de-escalation training, and I think that there are some training modules that I think have been shown to be pretty effective, and I think that there's some evidence to suggest that those can start to reduce some of those disparities in use of force that you've identified. I think it's also the case that as officers get more acclimated to kind of mental health concerns, which it sounds like they may already be to a large extent in Burlington, that they are more likely to see mental health as a kind of major factor in dealing with a whole range of civilians, whatever their background. I know we're running short on time, but I will just say that I think there are some training solutions with respect to de-escalation, but specifically keyed to this notion of deference and why interacting with people from some communities might kind of feel different from the police point of view. There's some evidence that those trainings can actually be quite effective in scaling back use of force. And they're also connected very much to what I was saying before about those difficult conversations, right? As you get people, cops and civilians together in rooms to talk about this stuff, openly and honestly, stuff comes to light about why people do what they do and why cops do what they do. And those conversations can be, I think, especially in a relatively small community like yours, can be extremely productive and a source of real trust building as well. So I definitely encourage more of that.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you any other commissioners have anything to say?
Just many thanks for taking the time to do this. It was really great.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for being here and taking your time out of your day with us. Much appreciated.
Of course.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Do we ever get a bathroom break?
All right, that concludes 4.02, and up next is agenda item 5.01, which is the chief's report. And with that, I give the floor to Chief Murad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I heard a request for a break, a quick bathroom break if possible. I think it's been a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have time for a 5-minute recess. Awesome. It is 7:59, and we'll see you all at, let's say 8:05 for make it nice and neat.
Very generous.
return from recess. So we will continue with agenda item 5.01, which is the chief's report. The floor is yours, Chief.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I have it's relatively short. I have some data to present. I first want to begin by expressing my deep gratitude and the agency's gratitude for what this body did with regard to talking to the City Council about the need for resources. Frankly, many of the things that both of our speaking guests have talked about tonight, whether it is the words of the state's attorney with regard to the ability to pursue what she acknowledged are more timely, more labor-intensive courses of action that are not oriented towards the just moving it down the criminal justice field, as it were, but instead diverting it in other yardage ways, or whether we're talking about some of the things that were mentioned by the professor with regard to the difference between proactive and reactive work. We don't make those distinctions anymore. We cannot. We can't. We are still diverting things. We are still sending a majority of our cases to alternative justice when appropriate, simply because that is, not only is it the right thing to do, but it is the best course of action when our state's attorney is making it clear that that's the direction in which she prefers we go. So we do that. We're still doing that, but it is labor intensive, and it causes more work and fewer officers to do that work. And furthermore, with regard to proactivity, there's no time. Traffic stops in decline from 2015 through probably 2019, largely owing to both explicit and implicit indications within the agency about what was important and what the chief wanted to be done. More recently, it is simply a fact of nobody's got time to stop cars unless they're causing something that's bleeding out, as in a great public safety violation. And we're seeing some impacts from that. I think that I can demonstrate that in the numbers. But before I do talk about those numbers, I just wanted to say again to this body how grateful I was for that support, for going to the council, saying that to the council, and I think making certain that they understood that it was not merely something that's being said by those who are most closely associated with the agency, that the concerns are elsewhere. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask our person at home, who I believe is moving the slideshow, if she can. Thank you. So these are the incidents. I show these to you. You've seen them before. They haven't changed. I just show it. This has been posted to the internet, or it's going to be very soon, and it's just another place for people to be able to familiarize themselves with how we prioritize the 130 incident categories that come out of Valcor. One of the challenges that we are now confronting as we talk about what a priority 1 versus a priority 2 is that oftentimes the distinction is not made until the officer gets to the scene or after the fact. It's the officer doing his or her report after the incident who recategorizes it from a suspicious event to an aggravated assault. Because the people who are calling don't know the difference between aggravated assault and simple assault or certain kinds of criminal categories. They just say, this thing's happening, or I'm fearful this thing is happening, or I don't even know what's happening, I'm just scared and there's lots of noise. And so as we talk about dispatch and working on that, one challenge is the fact that we don't know, and dispatch doesn't know what they have often until someone gets to the scene and figures that out. The next slide, please. So this is incident volume year to date, and as I said in our more recent meeting, the last at which I spoke, which I believe was June, year to date we're down. Overall incidents are down, drastically down. We've had they're down not only for the year, in which case they're down about 16%, but they're down from June through August as well, although that gap narrows. It narrows a lot. And I think the absolute number there, I don't have the math right in front of me, but I think it's a much smaller number. I think it's something like 4% or 8% down, much smaller than the year-to-date difference. So the year-to-date decline from 2020 to 2021 is large. The year-to-date decline from 2020 to 2021 for June through August is not as large, and it says that we're tightening up. Of those incidents that have happened since June 1st, 13% of them have had to be stacked according to the priority response plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. These are total incidents, just a different way to look at it. So the same data that we saw in the left-hand column on the previous slide, here it is just showing it sort of building up day over day for a year. So it climbs as incidents occur. Again, we see a marked difference between 2020 and 2021, and we see a marked difference between 2020 and 2015. But I do want to reiterate that the 79% drop in traffic stops constitutes half of the decrease from over those times. And if I take into account other kinds of proactive incidents, we are talking about that half of this decrease is BPD's efforts to reduce traffic stops and reduce the disparities that are found in interdiction-based traffic stops. Next slide, please. Priority 1. So unlike overall incident volume, Priority 1 is the same. It has just stayed the same. In fact, you can't even see 2021 in there very well. It's the black line. It obviously ends in August or almost in September there. And it's up above some years. It's twined in. These are all very close. And what needs to be recognized as well is that as these Priority 1s stay the same while the others fall, the Priority 1 leaps in percentage. Previously, in 2020, Priority 1 was about 8% of the total volume. It was less in previous years. It'll be more this year, because if overall volume is down and Priority 1 is staying essentially the same, then it's going to constitute a larger percentage of the calls that remain. And that has a lot to do with officer exhaustion and what officers are doing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Use of force. So here is our uses of force. We are still we're down for this category as well. That's a good thing. I do think it's possible that we'll end up having 2021's total ultimately exceeding 2020. If we look at that sort of trend line right now, 2020 really leveled off in November and December. Those were just very, very slow months. We see that with regard to incident volume as well. A little less so with Priority 1 incidents. But we're still, the number is down, and that is what is very important to me. Getting these numbers down so that we are, this indicates changes in improvements in training, improvements in our use of force policy, which has been largely adopted by the state and will be a state policy coming in October. And they took word for word sections of the policy that we together, myself and you, some of you as members of the Committee to Review Policing Practices, and then all of you as members of the Police Commission when we worked on that together in July of last year, June of July of last year, that is now the state standard. And I think that's something for all of us to be proud of. So what we see here, this diminishment of overall numbers is driven by changes in how we work. Now, each individual incident is driven by behavior. And to a certain extent, officers can't control the behavior that they encounter. They can't control what it is that they see out there or not. And as the Priority 1 from the previous slide shows us, the behavior that we think of as dangerous and criminal and the most risk-filled behavior is not changing in our city. Other kinds of behavior are, but we're not seeing changes in the stuff that is serious. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here are some selected incident trends. These are year to date through August 22nd. And we see many that are going down. We see many that are staying relatively stable. Two that have gone up a lot are mental health issues. Some of that is an improved ability on officers' part to mark it off. However, I think that's more likely to be seen in the mental health checkbox. And this is not the mental health checkbox, this is a mental health issue. This is when the incident is determined to be a mental health issue. The checkbox can be added to anything. You can have an aggravated assault with that checkbox. You can have a suspicious event with that checkbox. I do want officers to do that better. We're always working to make certain that checkbox is used more often when it's appropriate. But this shows that we are seeing these calls. Some of this, too, is the fact that callers are more aware of what is mental health or what appears to be mental health and add that in when they call. The other category that I think is concerning is overdose. Overdose, after 2 years of real work with that, with regard to, I think, ComStat, the community stat that the mayor really stood behind, as well as Chief Del Pozo, That work, that process drove it down a lot. We've seen it spike. And that spike, in my opinion, comes from the fact that COVID caused us to lose our eye on it. But if you look at the 2020 data, it was happening before COVID. There was a big uptick in January and February that preceded the pandemic. I think what we are also seeing, in addition to the pandemic and the fact that it's caused us to lose focus on it as organizations, and it's also frankly caused people to feel more despair, the kinds of underlying issues that sometimes lead to substance abuse or contribute to substance abuse disorder are more prevalent because of this pandemic. But I also think that the success that was seen in 2018 and 2019, particularly with regard to the wider availability of medically assisted treatment, or MAT, mostly through buprenorphine, but other substances as well, that had the sort of the low-hanging fruit of that has been plucked. So people who wanted MAT to get off of the other substances they were using and to find progress in their own journey towards being able to work with their substance abuse disorder and defeat it, those low-hanging fruit have been plucked. And what we have now are people who often avail themselves of MAT or other kinds of substances, not as a pathway off, but as a pathway towards handling it. Well, I don't have the thing that I need in front of me, which is again, the bulk of these overdoses have to do with fentanyl and other kind of opioids. So that is a contributing factor as well, and things we have to sort of plan for. Thank you. So this is just a reiteration of what I stated before with regard to the volume. Incidents are down 16% for the year, but our staffing has dropped by 35%. And so I really appreciate what this body did with regard to bringing that information to the City Council. And thank you. And that's what I have for the Chief's remarks.
Any questions for the chief? Now will be the time to do that.
Just a quick question. On the last page, D/C, I missed what that means.
Okay. Oh, well, not on the last page. On the first, on the
Selected
very, I
incident
think the second
page?
page, the first page of what I gave you. Oh, I'm sorry, this one.
Right here.
I apologize. The last page that I gave to you. I apologize, Commissioner. Yes, DC stands for disorderly conduct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And I don't, domestic, so mental health issue, domestic disturbance, domestic assault misdemeanor, and domestic assault felony, those are aggregated. Assault misdemeanor and assault felony, those are aggregated. Overdose, sex assault, disorderly conduct. Crash with injury or fatal, those are aggregated. And by the way, it ticked up this past year, which was interesting to me owing to the fact that, I don't know if all of you remember those Cannonball Run movies with Burt Reynolds, right? So the Cannonball Run is a real thing. There's a race that people do. It's illegal, but they modify their cars. Last March and April, the Cannonball race record was set and reset something like 5 times because there were no cops on the road anywhere. There was no one else on the road anywhere. And these guys would put together these cars and put extra big gas tanks in them, and they made it across country. I think the record was something like 26 hours from New York City to Los Angeles in a vehicle. There was lots of that, but we didn't see crashes with injury or fatalities increase here. We saw some increases elsewhere. We are seeing a lot of it this year. And some of that, at least in law enforcement circles, has to do with a belief that there are still fewer officers out there doing enforcement. And yet the traffic levels have risen back to normal. So people are driving the way they drove in the early days of the pandemic when you could get away with running through stop signs and going a little faster than you're supposed to. But once again, the traffic has returned and now we're having more crashes. That's being seen in many localities. Here, we see it with a return to our normal kinds of numbers of injury or fatal. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Chief, for that. Sorry, any further questions for the chief? All right, that concludes agenda item 5.01. Moving on to agenda item 6.01, future locations of commission meetings. And with that, I'll give the floor to Commissioner Grant.
Thank you. I was able to get some research started with different locations throughout the city and types of information that they would need in order to host the meetings. So I'll start with the one community center on North Street, which I feel it would be a great space. Unfortunately, there are some things that would prevent us at this time from considering that location. Number one, they have some staffing issues. And then number two, the space is actually owned by the Champaign Housing Trust. And so in order to kind of pay for the space, there's like a rental fee to use the space. And this space would be, if you're familiar watching the MP3 for Ward 3 meetings, it would be that larger room. There is a smaller room that could be perhaps used in the future. I have not seen that room. I would have to go and kind of scope it out to see if it would be appropriate. But it's kind of a moot issue at this time because of the increase in COVID cases in the city. They're not booking those spaces at this time. So it'd be something that we have to come back to. The Miller Center would definitely allow us to use their space. There is no charge. They would need advance notice so that they can account for staff to be there over the course of the meeting. And we are responsible for providing any type of equipment related to trying to have a hybrid meeting. So we would be responsible for making that happen. Some other spaces that I was looking into and just waiting back for some confirmation with the person who manages the meeting space. This would be in the south end. In the DPW space, Department of Public Works, they have a meeting space. So I've obtained that contact person, and then they emailed me some questions, which I did reply back to. So I advise what we normally schedule. So we may need to start to schedule our meetings to have really firm dates, because part of going to these locations is going to be needing to commit to very specific dates with sufficient notification. So I did let them know how long our meetings could be, minimum to 2 hours, up to possibly 4 hours, especially if we have executive session. And then I have a message out to City Market, which the South End City Market apparently has a meeting space. So I have reached out to them, but I don't have any specific information as of yet. So those were the 4 locations that I started with that I think people would be familiar with. That also one of the things I was thinking about, because downtown has parking. There is parking downtown, but there is a perception of how accessible that parking is, right? Because everybody wants to be able to be close. And some people don't like being in the parking garages, and I recognize that. So when I was looking at these other spaces, I was just accounting for the fact that they all have parking that people can use that would be very easy to get to and then get into the locations. And that is all I have, if anyone has any questions.
What about just some of the schools, like Sustainability Academy and Champlain Elementary?
Oh, that's a good question. I will look into Champlain. And I'll look into sustainability, especially since the next door, the one center, community center, wouldn't be available for a while. So, thank you.
So as of now, I know our next meeting, I think it's September 27th. Don't quote me on that, but we do have it this space reserved. So October, I guess ideally October we would not be in this space. We could maybe circle back to the space months down the line, but try to bounce them around. Is DPW probably the best option for that October meeting, or too early to tell?
Might be too early to tell, but one of the good things about that space is they routinely do meetings out of that space. I mean, their own commission meetings, they run out of that space.
Okay.
So if we do October, would we be looking at Tuesday the 26th?
If that's the fourth Tuesday of the month, then yes.
That is the fourth Tuesday of the month.
I wonder if it might be better to book this for October and to just get all of our options, all that information together, because I think we need to book far enough in advance. And so that would be my suggestion, is to book this for October and to continue to work on this. I'm sorry that the one community center isn't available, because when I think about people who don't have as much access to the meetings, it is people in the Old North End.
I agree.
And for a variety of different reasons. And so finding a space there would be really great, maybe at the St. Joseph's School, where AALV is and other organizations, maybe there's space there. One of the things that presents a difficulty, and I'm glad our lawyer is here, because this might be something she might be able to respond to, is that executive session can prove difficult because we need a separate room, privacy, so on and so forth. And I'm wondering if over the next few months we could, I just realized this is not a very good suggestion. So I was just thinking about executive session on Zoom, partly because of the Delta variant and maybe some of the difficulties of using these spaces, but that might be, I think, dicey now that I think about it. But I just want to throw out some ideas to help us figure it out.
Yes, any further questions or comments on this?
Just one more thing. Make sure you check for parking.
The microphone, sorry.
I'm sorry. Make sure we check for parking at DPW. It's a huge building, and they have some parking on the side, but they don't have a lot of parking, as far as I know, having been there multiple times for permits.
You know, another possibility is the faith community, right? There are a number of churches, and they may be willing to allow us to use their space.
Sorry, I will just throw out there as far as the faith community.
Sorry, do you mind just being into the microphone? Sorry.
I think that's an interesting suggestion that may have some implications for open meeting law, as well as some constitutional implications. So depending on the space, what kind of religious artifacts are in it, that's something that the council will really need to scrutinize with a very keen eye before booking any spaces in religious spaces.
Thank you. Any further comments on 6.01?
Thank you, Milo. Thank you.
Thanks for doing that.
Yeah. Thank you, Mila, for looking into this. All right, closes that agenda item. Next is 6.02, Commission Work Plan. And basically, sorry.
Okay, so I think I sent out to everyone a copy, kind of a draft copy, but I haven't heard back from everybody yet. But if we could do that by, sort of next week, maybe next Wednesday or so, I can ship out the revised version. And I'm hoping that's helpful to us, just to have kind of a big overview across time, and maybe at a meeting, the next meeting we have, we might want to talk about what are the next kinds of steps you want to take from January to, say, June. So we have kind of an ongoing process. I really have appreciated all of the learning opportunities that we're providing for ourselves and everyone else. I think they're really beneficial. And what the good news is that they're online, and I think we ought to probably publicize that for people in the community that are interested that couldn't get here. So if we could have stuff to me by next Wednesday, if you haven't responded already, that would be really helpful for that work plan, then I'll put it out.
Susie, does what's attached to the agenda reflect any of the changes that we would have sent you?
Not yet.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for doing this. It's a lot of work.
So in the interim that you're waiting for changes, for September, we had discussed having SAMHSA speak, Brian Coro, and just will we be going through with that? And who would be responsible for organizing those visitors and so forth?
Good question.
Shireen's name is down tentatively as the organizer, to contact the organizations and to work to invite them.
I think you're looking at December. It look,
September 28th,
no, if you look at the chart,
I
there,
can't find the chart.
unless,
it's up above. Why trauma, trauma and medicine?
right, and there are question marks for the contact person.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you,
So can you
Got it.
explain, is Brian with SAMHSA?
Brian Coro is the person who is at NACOL that spoke to
He
us at our
spoke to
last
us,
training.
right.
Yep.
And so he's with NACOL, and then we were hoping to get someone from SAMHSA, is that what I'm understanding as well? There,
That was, I think, the hope.
So then there would be a question of which commissioner would take on the responsibility for contacting these folks and organizing their presence at the meeting?
Yes.
I can work on that.
but just to be clear, we're going to contact Brian from NACOL, but then we're trying to identify someone from SAMHSA, am I reading this right? Or is this,
That's what we had talked about, I think, at some point.
yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk with Susie offline about SAMHSA. It's a national group, so I don't know.
Okay, we'll talk offline.
Yep.
Who is going to get in touch with Brian?
I can do that.
I can.
It's up to you. You want to do that, and then we'll work on SAMHSA?
Do one the other,
Okay.
or
Sure. So we'll work on the SAMHSA if you want to contact Brian?
I will contact Brian.
Okay.
I'm sorry, if I might just offer a suggestion, it's complicated to organize two speakers, and I think the same person needs to be responsible so that everything gets coordinated. So I think having two separate people makes it logistically a little bit more complicated.
Well, as long as as one of them CC'd with the email, may not have to respond to the person, but as long as one of the others CC'd in it, that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I think what we can do is use the timing that we used for tonight, those two slots. I think that our agenda tonight was pretty aggressive in terms of how much time we're going to take tonight, but, yeah.
Yeah, I can at least do, check his availability to
Sure.
start off. I mean, he may come back and say that
Yeah, we'll just.
that
stop
date
it.
is not a good date for him, so we can establish the date and time
Okay.
and then confirm a specific time for him.
So one of the things that we could talk about with SAMHSA is they have the trauma-informed training, so it could be that we have someone come talk to us about what that possibly could look like.
And Brian Coro, that was his area as well, so I think having both of them would be really, really helpful.
Any further comment on this agenda item?
So this will be on the agenda for the next meeting as well, after Susie gets some comments and so forth. Great.
Yep, so we can have this posted to board docs and not run afoul of open meeting laws, correct? With that, moving on to agenda item 6.03, which is the body worn camera video release policy.
So if folks remember, back in April, we reviewed this revised policy, and we had requested a few changes to it. And so we are now getting this back from the city attorney's office. And I'd like to make a motion to adopt this policy with two changes. And just give me 1 second here, I'll read the motion. So the motion to approve the revised body-worn camera footage release policy with 2 changes. Number 1, change number 4 to read, "The commission shall revisit this policy in March 2022 to evaluate and assess implementation." And the second motion is to delete the phrase, "Any member of the public who wishes to view the blurred footage or redacted audio may request that information in accordance with the Vermont Public Records Act." With regard to that's the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Susie, second. Oh, were you going to elaborate on?
Yep.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Just elaborate for the public, please.
So the changing it to March is because we had estimated that we'd need 6 months to evaluate the policy, and it's been a while since we passed this, so 6 months from today is March 2022. So that's the reason for changing that. In regard to the last part, what the city attorney brought to my attention is that this is redundant. The second part on public wishing to view the blurred footage or redacted audio is redundant because earlier in the policy states that the body cam video footage would be released proactively. And so it's not necessary for people to request it through FOIA.
So Stephanie, are we striking that line?
I am saying to delete it, that's correct, yep.
So, thank you. One of the comments from the city attorney is as to paragraph 1B about discretionary use of force, and I'm wondering if we have an adequate understanding as written.
Can I maybe see if we're all on the same page with that? As I recall, we had an extended discussion about that, and what we learned was that not all uses of force are discretionary. And so we wanted to change the verbiage so that we were referring to those cases in which use of force is discretionary. So for example, pointing a gun is not always discretionary. And that was the reason for the revision. And Chief, is that, the new wording, is that consistent with what you think is appropriate?
So I'm afraid that I haven't seen the new wording other than what you're discussing right now. There are instances, you're correct, in which certain kinds of uses of force are not discretionary. And actually the new use of, I would also note that the new use of force policy that is going to be used by the state should probably be incorporated into this, or at least not incorporated, but its restrictions and definitions need to be accounted for in this. So it mentions, for example, that there are certain things that are not uses of force, but are not discretionary as well. It talks explicitly about the use of firearms for doing certain kinds of building sweeps and things like that, when those are or are not a use of force. And so I think that might be important. Our policy doesn't get into that specificity. The new state policy does, I believe, Matt, am I right? I mean, I remember reading that part in the new state policy. So a description of when pointing a firearm does and doesn't constitute a use of force, and it talks about entries and those kinds of operations. So yes, I think that's accurate. I think, I also wanted to note, I have a job description that I am working on for the redaction specialist. I have not yet sent it over to HR, but it's in my folders as something that I started. I should be able to finish that as far as getting it to HR as a draft for them to then improve and fix. I should be able to do that, if not this week, then very early next week. It's something that we were authorized to do in the brand new budget starting July 1st, and so we need to get our, there's a lot of hiring movement going on for a lot of different positions, but we do want that one. Because as I stated, back when we talked about this the first time, I want to, but cannot comply with this until I get that position in place. But insofar as the definitions of what, yes, I think that's correct. There are certain uses of force that aren't discretionary, and I also think that everybody should take a look at the new state use of force policy, which I will share with this body after this meeting.
Chief, if you haven't seen this, can I read this portion of the policy, the revised? So it says, an incident of discretionary police use of force that involves the use of aerosol agents, conducted electrical weapons, police batons, less lethal impact munition, firearms, or other lethal force. So those are the kinds of videos that would be proactively released. So that was our attempt to differentiate especially with regard to firearms.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for the sake of our own workload, I would strike aerosol from that, but I know that that's something that's in it and was in it before.
We will have the opportunity, if we pass this, to revisit it in 6 months, and so perhaps that's something we could, think about how that impacts this.
So we had a motion on the floor. It was seconded by Susie. Is there any further questions or comments about those two modifications? Sorry, those two amendments are the technical one, but those two changes to the policy.
So do we look at the state plan or before we do this, or we do that retroactively?
I think that's a, question for discussion. I'll just state my own opinion on that, and that is we can always revise this policy, but I have a real concern with what I have seen in the slowness of government action. This policy was drafted last October, and it is 9-10 months later, and I'm in favor of voting on this tonight and looking at the state policy. If we decide to revise it per that, I'd be all for that, and maybe that's what happens within the 6-month period. But my personal view is that, that the community expects us to take actions, and this was something that was requested of us to do over almost a year ago, and that we really need to move this along.
Thank you.
Any further question or comments? I'm not seeing or hearing any. All in favor of the proposed amendments to this policy, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes unanimously. Thank you for that. Moving on to agenda item 6.04, excited delirium and preliminary discussion.
If I might just say something, because I was working on the agenda while Jabu was attending to Life Matters this past week. I think the idea of having a preliminary discussion is to decide what it is we need to have as testimony, perhaps is a strong word, but information. What kind of information will inform any decision or discussion? And so we might think about who would we invite to speak about that, and who might be responsible for inviting people to speak on that, and sort of figuring out how we actually have the policy discussion now, and then schedule that in our work plan.
Chief, you have the floor, followed by Milo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That term is not in the new use of force policy that the state has.
It's not in the use of force policy that the state has?
So the section that is in our use of force policy, which we drafted with an ER doctor, the Association of ER Doctors does recognize the term. It is a very important term to them. It's a hugely important set of evaluation standards, and I worked on it with an ER doctor who was a member of the Committee to Review Policing Practices and defined the language for us, and also defined the things that we need to do when observing those conditions. It's irrelevant now, simply because it is not in the state use of force policy, and it won't be part of ours either.
Thank you for that.
I disagree that it's not relevant, because we've recently seen it used in use of force reports. So that's how it came up, that we're using that term in the city. So I do believe that it is something that people need to be educated about, that the department needs to be educated about. It is not a legitimate term. I actually I actually would like to read part of something. This is from the American Medical Association, the AMA. This is a press release that they did June 24th of this year. A policy adopted by physicians, residents, and medical students at the American Medical Association's special meeting of its House of Delegates opposes excited delirium as a medical diagnosis and warns against the use of certain pharmacological interventions solely for a law enforcement purpose without a legitimate medical reason. The new policy addresses reports that show a pattern of using the term excited delirium and pharmacological interventions such as ketamine as a justification for excessive police force, disproportionately cited in cases where Black men die in law enforcement custody. Specifically, the policy confirms the AMA's stance that the current evidence does not support excited delirium as an official diagnosis and opposes its use until a clear set of diagnostic criteria has been established, denounces excited delirium as a sole justification for law enforcement use of excessive force, underscores the importance of emergency physician-led oversight of medical emergencies in the field, opposes the use of sedative and dissociative drugs as an intervention for an agitated individual in a law enforcement setting without a legitimate medical reason, recognizes the risks that sedative and dissociative drugs have in relation to an individual's age, underlying medical conditions, and potential drug interactions when used outside of a hospital setting by a non-physician. So that's where I'll stop. There's a little bit more in terms of their press release. This is being discussed nationally. In the city of Burlington, I believe that we are small enough where we can eradicate the use of this term. Whatever is going on with an individual, we should use actual terms, not a term that was, quite frankly, made up, not a term that has a lot of racial disparities. Something, and Stephanie helped me out. I want to say it was 10%, but I can't remember 10% of deaths in police custody involve the use of this term. And there's various lawsuits. There's a whistleblower suit that is happening in Minnesota where an EMT felt they had to leave their job because they were being forced to medicate people by law enforcement. So there's just a lot of things that we could cover, but I feel that we need to eradicate the use. The fact that it came up in one of our publicly discussed reports, and it came up under 2 different incidents, if I'm remembering correctly, tells me it's being used in the city. And it's not something that we should be using. We'd probably want to invite the fire chief, because I believe the fire department oversees EMT's response. So it might even involve a conversation with the hospital, right? Because you're saying that you spoke to someone who was on one of the previous committees, and they reviewed the term. I remember the term coming up, but there was so much other things to cover on that particular committee, and we didn't get to everything as it was. But I think now we just need to take the time to really examine a term that's hurtful, right? And we also know that there is, not only in law enforcement, but there is structural racism in healthcare as well. So when you bring that in and you end up using a term which often involves and could involve medicating people, it just brings in a lot of issues that we need to review. Thank you.
I wonder if it's a possibility to relook at the use of force policy and maybe just strike that out from it, or is that just oversimplifying it?
Well, I think I mean, if it's not in the use of force policy, as the chief says, we know it's being used in the department, right? So what kind of training, education needs to be done in the department to eradicate its use?
And,
Is what I guess I'd like to see us explore.
I'm sorry, I was under the impression that, so the state just adopted their use of force policy. We still have ours, which can, I guess, supersede that, right? Is that the floor, I guess?
Ours will cease to exist, I believe it's October 1st, Matt. I mean, I may be off on that date, but I believe on October 1st, the new state policy goes into effect, and that is every single agency's policy.
And ours does have excited delirium in it.
Ours does, that is
Yes,
correct.
so that will go away, so it does.
That's correct.
Right.
And it has never been used as a justification for force. It's been used as a description of the situations that can ensue after force. And frankly, the things that it lists in our use of force policy, which is available online and publicly available, those are conditions and criteria that I don't want to train officers not to recognize or take care of or address appropriately.
That's not what I said. They can use the actual terms, right? It's this made-up term that's supposed to just summarize all these other terms. We just need to use the actual terms, right? And we need to use legitimate medical diagnoses when we're talking about, I think, using sedatives on people or dissociative drugs, or when we're using things in the field. I understand, as I've started to look in this, there might be some consultations, but at the same time, it's just not a term we should be using. We need to recognize the racial disparities with the particular term. So I'm not saying that officers should ignore behaviors, symptoms that have been lumped in to this term. What we're seeing is overuse of this term, right? Just throwing it out there to justify bad behavior in some departments. We want to avoid that here. We want people to really be thinking in terms of what they are in fact dealing with, instead of like, oh, it's excited delirium. We want to eradicate that term. We know this term, and part of it would be educating people who maybe don't know. It has a lot of racial disparities associated with it, and that is a problem that we don't want to be a part of, considering our other racial disparities, right? So I could go on, but I will defer to my fellow commissioner.
So I really value exploring things in detail when it's related to a policy change. And we do have our attorney waiting for us for executive session. And so I think this is a good preliminary discussion, but I think we need to make a decision about whether we want to schedule this. And again, we need a variety of perspectives in order to think this through. So I think that discussion takes some planning, and I might just propose that we think of it after the next meeting, so maybe October, and that would give some time to kind of research who might be available to talk to us about it and so forth.
I agree with that approach. I think that makes sense.
I'm also in favor of that. I'm not.
I think it's a very important discussion to have, because whether we use the term or don't use the term, and I agree, I've read some similar things, Commissioner Grant. The terminology is really important. It has a very loaded history. And just because you take the words away doesn't take behavior away. And so I think we really need to talk about this at much more depth as a commission.
Maybe there's a possibility of asking whoever speaks to us from SAMHSA or Brian Coro to, comment on that as well, if they have some expertise in that area.
No, I'm in favor of that as well.
Any further questions? Sorry, any further comments or questions on 6.04? All right, with that, moving on to agenda item 7.01, which is the use of force incident report. And seeing how we did it last time, we received this. It was been posted on board docs. And if the commissioners have any questions about any incidents, are there any questions for any incidents that popped up on the use of force report that would be appropriate for now?
I just want to say on the record that we did have the ability to look at all the video from last month, and thank you for uploading all of those. I think we had made the ask that, I think there were 9 cases, if I'm not mistaken, last month, and all videos, or each incident had at least one video, so thank you.
Not seeing or hearing any questions. And that moves us to agenda item 8.01, and that's which is commendations. Usually Shannon does that, but she's not with us, so I'm not sure if you're doing that on her behalf or.
No, I'm afraid I don't have that information in front of me.
All right.
It just shows how important Shannon is.
All right. In that case, we can just add July's into next month's meeting. Going on to agenda item 9.01, commissioner updates and/or comments.
I'd just like to make a brief comment. I was really struck by Susie's suggestion around a summit around mental health. I think that we have a role to play as a commission because we see the impact on the department and we see the data that we just saw. I think it would be important for us to leverage some movement on this, whether it's through a resolution or connecting with city councilors or something, and maybe we can think about it and put it on the agenda for next meeting. That might include a motion to urge the city and city partners to convene a summit like this.
Thank you.
I just want to add that it's not that difficult to do. It could be a one-day deal where we bring everybody around the table from their own perspectives, lay out some of the data, and talk about where do we go from here. But I think it's really important to have some legislators there that represent our community and the mayor's office and the mayor himself, among others.
Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 10.01, which is the next meeting agenda items, which I feel like we kind of broached with the commission work plan, with SAMHSA, reached out to Brian Core from NACOL. Any other big ones jumping out of us? I also finding people to talk to with regards to excited delirium, but I believe that was for our October meeting. So I think basically it's kind of there in the work plan, but unless you want to.
Maybe just do a check-in on September about potential speakers for October and educational materials, so not a full length, but just a check-in.
Happy to put that in. Any further comments on that? Not seeing or hearing any. And before we move into executive session, I want to state that this meeting will be adjourned at the conclusion of executive session with no actionable items to be taken. So with that, I move that we go into executive session.
Seconded.
Seconded by Steph. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye. Sorry.
Aye.
The commission does need to actually explicitly state a reason for going into
My apologies. That slipped my mind. Sorry. I move that we move into executive session to talk about discipline and citizen complaints.
And I would just suggest some language to the commission that you move to go into that session pursuant to 1 VSA 313A4, which is the statutory site.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? This.
Yes, I would just suggest some language to include in that motion that the portion of the open meeting law regarding executive session that I believe the chair is describing is codified at 1 VSA
1 VSA 13.
313A4, which deals with disciplinary proceedings. And I would also suggest to the council some language about attendance of people in the room that are not members of the commission pursuant to 1 VSA 313B, which allows for legal counsel and people with information germane to the executive session.
And
So both of those I would suggest to the commission are appropriate for the motion.
okay, and I got the first part and second part. 1 VSA 313B for legal inviting.
Inviting legal counsel and also others, such as the chief, who have information that's germane to the executive session.
Okay, thank you very much for clarification.
Jabu, could I make a suggestion?
Yep.
Would you email him the verbiage so we don't have to do this every single time? Because it is long and cumbersome.
It is, yes, and it's just important to describe with some adequate certainty why we're going into executive session. So I'm happy to provide those commonly used sites for the commission.
Thank you. We've been without a city representation for quite some time, so appreciate it.
Whip us into shape.
All right. I motion that we enter executive session to discuss disciplinary matters pursuant to 1 VSA 313A4, and we also for 1 VSA 313B for inviting our legal counsel for that. So that's a motion. I'll take a second. Seconded by Susie. Sorry, her hand was faster. All in favor, raise your hand to say aye. That passes unanimously. And awesome. I say we recess for 5 minutes if people need to use the bathroom, and we'll see you downstairs
Sharon Busher Room.
at the Sharon Busher Room.